Well, the mood is depending where you look. There's a lot of agitation, I think, much more than before the previous several elections. I think that there's some anxiety on behalf of the people who want Putin to get elected in the first round. They are not sure whether this will actually be possible. There's some, I would say, there's some depressing moments and some depressing mood among those who do not have their candidate as one of those contestants, one of those who will contest the seat in March. But I would say the good thing about what's happening in Russia is that there's a lot of calm. As I said, there's anxiety. There's some, depressing. There's a couple of depressing moments, but essentially there's a lot of underlying calm. People are getting used to more contestation during elections. Well, it's the expression of, I think, the fundamental fact about Russia today, namely that a lot of people who previously were not interested in politics at all are now paying attention. And more than paying attention, they have their own preferences, and they express those preferences. And there's far less tolerance among the ordinary Russian people for all sorts of vote rigging, all sorts of rigged elections, rigged campaigns, unfair campaigns, and this is new. What's also interesting to note is that these protest rallies have been going on peacefully. This is very interesting. You have people demonstrating against Putin, and then people, well, let's say, with some administrative support from the authorities demonstrating in favor of Putin. But so far there have been there has been no collision between the two. There have been no clashes. There has been no police brutality that people had become accustomed to before. Well, I'm sure it will. The issue is how strong the protests will be, because many people, just want no more Putin, and they will not accept any verdict from the Electoral Commission, even though Putin may actually be able to poll 50% plus a few votes. Even then, a lot of people will be unhappy. They will be demonstrating against that. They will claim, with, I think, a lot of evidence behind them, that the election campaign had been unfair, that not everyone was free to do what people were supposed to be, to have the right to do under the Constitution, things like that. So he means to win in the first round, and I think he is sure that he will win in the first round. He has been able to mobilize his supporters, something that he was not very good at doing before. He sort of relied on the silent majority. He relied on the administrative support that his principal political machine, the United Russia Party, was providing. But now, having seen the failure of the United Russia Party to get enough votes from Putin's perspective in the December Duma vote, he basically eliminated the party from his campaign. We don't hear about the party. Now there's a leader of a party waging a campaign to become president of Russia, and you don't hear about the party. You don't even hear about the Popular Front that Putin also organized last year. So it's just Putin. It's the personality of Mr. Vladimir Putin. I think he's been more successful than a lot of people thought he would be. There is some support. He does reach out to the lower paid categories of people. He does reach out to members of the military, of the police, other law enforcement agencies. He does reach out to the people who live in smaller towns, people with, let's say, with a secondary education, that kind of electorate. It's his electorate in many ways. People who, essentially, the people, and there are many people in Russia, who depend on the state and who see Putin as their protector. I think we just entered a new political period, or a new period in Russia's political history. I would say that December 5, the day of the protests against the rigging of the Duma vote, was day one of this new period. And I'm sure that the protests will continue. I'm sure that beyond the protests, there will be political forces organized who will come up with all sorts of agendas, people who will organize themselves and press the government, press the Duma, press the media, the courts, to the law enforcement agencies to do something about corruption. This is a stifling phenomenon. Russia has never been as corrupt, especially at the top of the system, as it is now. This is a consensus statement in Russia. But Mr. Putin, although he also talks about fighting corruption, does fairly little from the perspective of ordinary Russians to deal with that. So I think that with this awakening of the people who started looking around, stopped being exclusively focused on their own little things, little whatever, their personal things, their personal strategies, personal well-being, and started thinking more broadly, looking at the country as a whole and asking questions about how the country is run. Can it be run better? Who would be a better candidate to run it, etc. Well, normally, as in all countries, and Russia is no exception, elections are fought on domestic issues. Foreign policy could be an add-on, but not in a big way. I think that there's something to the Russia position on, say, Syria or Iran that is related to the presidential campaign, but I wouldn't say it's too much. I wouldn't say that link is the most important link. Although I would say that there's a general view shared by a lot of people around Mr. Putin that what people call the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening has been produced to a significant degree by the various NGOs linked to various American interests. And there is a claim that Putin supports that a lot of Russian opposition, people say unstructured opposition, i.e. the parties that are not represented on the Duma, in fact are paid by the U.S. State Department and things like that. So you see a link here, but it's always been there. Well, I think that Russia is essentially trying to launch a dialogue between the government and the opposition in Syria. I think it's the right thing, but it comes too late. It's inconceivable at this point that it's possible to have a productive dialogue between those two forces. I think that the opposition doesn't want to continue to live in the country dominated by the Assad family. So the Assad family must go from the standpoint of the opposition. That was not necessarily the case a few months ago. That was not necessarily the case a year ago when those things were starting. And Russia's mediation is relatively new, meaning it's relatively late, or I would say maybe too late. What Russia wants to prevent, and I think it may be more successful at that than in instilling dialogue in Syria, is a repeat of the Libya scenario. That is something that the Russians want to avoid for a number of reasons. Some of them having a lot to do with the Russian view of how international relations should be structured, what sort of a world order should prevail in the 21st century. But there's also a fear of American interventionism becoming a constant feature of international politics, and it may be Syria. It was say Libya yesterday. It's Syria today. Maybe tomorrow it may be one of the republics of the former Soviet Union, and that is something that Russia wants to avoid clearly. Well, there's not much of a role, frankly. Russia's position has always been in support of an agreement between Iran and the international community, i.e. the IAEA. And Russia, back in 2009, thought it had a deal, and it did agree with Iran and France on the modalities of supplying Iran with nuclear fuel, and then taking it back for reprocessing after it's spent in exchange for Iran's agreement to have its nuclear program monitored and thus having its nuclear program safely within the peaceful parameters, so that the international community is fully confident that Iran is not working to produce a bomb. Mainly through the differences within the Iranian leadership, and due to the difficulties and complexities of the international situation in 2009, and we'll remember it was the year of the election in Iran, and then there was this green revolution, an aborted green revolution in Iran, green movement at least, that wanted to establish its authority in Iran. All this came to naught. And since then, Russia has been pleading for dialogue. It doesn't support more sanctions against Iran. It says that more sanctions would empower the wrong guys and disempower the more pragmatic thinking Iranians. And clearly Russia does not support a military solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. It believes that that would usher in a virtual catastrophe for the region. And the region is not that far away from Russia's own borders. It doesn't really want a spike in radicalism and extremism among the Muslims so close to its own borders. Well, I think it keeps changing all the time. I think that it would be right to say the Russians are not satisfied with their role position in the world, primarily because of their fairly small economic base. It's still a country that has, 2% of the global GDP. In terms of purchasing power parity standings, GDP, Russia is the seventh largest economy in the world, and this is a little bit too little for most Russians. They want to move up the ladder. They are also dissatisfied with Russia being essentially a provider of raw materials, energy, stuff to the rest of the world, and the importer of many other things. They are dissatisfied with Russia having deindustrialized itself in the wake of the Soviet collapse. There are many things that, and of course, Russia is a country that doesn't have allies among the major powers of the world. It doesn't have, let's say, bad relations with most countries, but sometimes relations are pretty tense. Say with the United States, there will be periods of reset. There'll be periods of pretty heightened tensions. So the Russians are still looking for a better role for themselves, a better place for themselves in the world, and of course there are lots of views of how this new, better position in the world could be attained, and this is also part of the election campaign in a way.